Chavre, how are you? I hope everyone is gesund, stark und freilich, begashmis und beruchnis. Healthy, strong, and happy physically and spiritually. A freilich and Shchedish, Terez Shchedish Oder, Lamed Shvat, Erev Shabbos Kodesh, Parshas Shkolim, Parshas Mishpotim. I'd like to continue on the theme that we spoke last week and to clarify some things. Last week, the thought of the week was about absolute standards. This week, we're going to talk about getting a life. But before we start, we'll start as usual with a pasuk from the Rebbe's Kapitel, pasuk Zayin of Kapitel Kuf Yotes. Oidcha b'yoyshe levov, b'lomdi mishpotei tzidkecha. I will give thanks to you with uprightness of heart when I learn the judgments of your righteousness. You could think maybe we could learn Pshat. Oidcha b'yoyshe levov. I want to give thanks with uprightness of heart. Can be interpreted to mean I want to give thanks for my sense of uprightness. Yoyshe, integrity, good character. How did I get my sense, our sense of Yoyshe, being straight and honest? Belomdi mishpotei tzidkecha, from learning the judgments of your righteousness. Mishpotei, from the word of our parsha, Mishpotim. What is Mishpotim? This week's parsha starts something that hasn't happened until now, and that is we start talking about mitzvahs, the laws. Until now, primarily, one could say that the Torah was a storybook. Chas v'shalom, we don't mean a storybook like any other storybook, but there was a story, there was a narrative, starting with the creation of the world, Adam, the Avos, the Shvatim, Mitzrayim, Matan Torah. So there's a chain of events all up to last week's Parsha. This week's portion of the week, it starts with Eila Mishpotim Asher Tosem Lefneihem. Your student of 5 years old might say, oh, now we get to the boring stuff. Until now, there was excitement, there was adventure, there was exploits. Now starts the laws. As many commentators explain, the word Mishpotim in particular is referring to social laws, a way of life, interpersonal relationships, damages, properties, ownership, etc. And it explains that the difference between Mishpotim and Chukim is Chukim, to talk about the contrast, the extremes. Chukim represents the religious laws like statutes, the laws of purity and impurity, matara, kashrus. And we say that the difference between the social laws, Mishpotim, and Chukim is that Mishpotim are the laws that we can relate to with our human intellect. We can understand them. And here we come to a beautiful idea. The Rebbe in the Sikha says that Parshas Mishpotim is the 18th Parsha of the Torah. 18 represents Chai, life. So there's the way the Rebbe explains it, and I'll get to it in a second. But on a simple level, maybe we could take that word and say, Parshas Mishpotim is the first Parsha where we see that Judaism is not a subject, but a way of life. Torah is not a subject, but a way of life. Here, for the first time, we start legislating a way of life according to Hashem's will. So, number one, Parshas Mishpotim is Chai because it tells us about life and how we have to live our life, our day-to-day so-called mundane life. But the deeper meaning, and what the Rebbe explains, is a thought that we spoke about already many times, that the whole of Judaism could be boiled down to two strands, two concepts, two themes, bittul and yichud. Our relationship with Hashem has an aspect of subservience, obedience, self-nullification, that's bittul. We could also call it transcendence. But there's also yichud, self-actualization, being united. We spoke about this, I think, many times. This is the difference in the relationship of a master and subject, king and subject, or father and son. When you have a subject, the point is, the subject has to follow orders. Nasa koydel nishwa. We will do before we understand. Then there's a son, father. The father doesn't only want the son to be obedient, the father wants the son to understand, or a teacher, student. So we have two sorts of commandments. We have those commandments that are chukim, where they're meant to demonstrate how the Jew is loyal to Hashem no matter what. Whether he understands or he doesn't understand, he follows God's will. And that represents transcendence. It's about serving a significant other, something which is totally infinite and beyond you. The supreme authority. But then there's another side to our relationship with God, where we become united, a meeting of the mind, so to speak. God shares his insights, levels of his wisdom, and he wants us to toil with our human brains and to become united and understand things the way Hashem understands it. Human logic uniting with God logic and becoming one. And that's the purpose, that's the idea of Mishpotim. So the Rebbe explains, since usually a person enjoys more things that he understands, so therefore Parshas Mishpotim is the 18th, the Chai Parsha. Which Parsha, which subject matter in Torah is something that a person enjoys more than anything else? The part that he understands is the part that he enjoys. And that's what we mean in general when somebody says, this is the life. That means you're enjoying it. It's gishmak. And that's why when it comes to the Mishpotim, that's where a person has a gishmak. And when it comes to Mishpotim, that's the order of the day. Those laws that are the social laws, we're meant to study and then emulate, because it teaches us about the human condition. And that's connected with the pasuk we said before, this is the novelty. We're going to come to new insights, new profundity when it comes to social laws. In interpersonal relationships, we're going to come to higher levels of standards that you cannot imagine. And this is connected to what I said last week about absolute standards. I mentioned that Sinai comes from the word sinna, and we have to hate. I want to make it clear. It doesn't mean, God forbid, that we hate anyone, or that we're judgmental or critical about anyone. It means the act. As we say, Yitamu Chatoyim, the loy choitim, we say evil acts should be obliterated, but not the sinners. Everyone has a good side to him. Everyone has a redemptive angle when we're talking about the human spirit. But if we're talking about acts, we have to know this is right and this is wrong, as we spoke last week. And that's why the truth is, in the commandments of Mishpotim, we really see this fusion of discipline and passion, and rules and relationships. You have to have things that go together. And that's why, even when it comes to Mishpotim, we right away bring out that when it comes to the social laws of the Torah, it's also from God. There's also an aspect of absolute. And that's what Rashi says, Ve'ela ha-mishpotim, af elu misinai, even our social laws and laws about interpersonal relationships, their origin is God. And this is something we're very clear about. Just like we understand when it comes to time, space, the universe, electrons, protons, neutrons, the cosmic orbit in the galaxies, we understand that there's a God and he's a creator and it's beyond any human being. So let me ask you a question. Just as when it comes to the laws of nature, you understand that there's a force that's greater than you that could put it all together and regulates how it should work. Now, why when it comes to soul matters, the human being and life on this planet Earth, we have to realize that there's something, some intelligence, some being that's far, far, far greater than humans that should determine and deem what is justice. Because we can't leave it up to man and his whims and moods and feelings. And this is what it says in a Yom Yom on the 22nd day of Shavat, that there are two kinds of laws. Laws that generate life and laws that result from life. So that's another aspect to Mishpotim, being called the 18th Parsha Chai. You want to know what life is? Life has to be seen through the lens of the Torah, because actually the Torah creates the life. As it says that the Torah is the blueprint of the world. So God looked at the Torah, used the Torah as the blueprint, and then created the world. Because the Torah is the ultimate truth, it alone can tell us what the true reality of the world is. Last week we mentioned Rabbi Twersky, and he passed away. Chai Shvat was still in the middle of the Shloshim. He writes in an article about this idea of social laws having the origin in Hashem. And he says, in modern times, we have witnessed the hazards of a system of laws that is totally subject to human determination. Just several decades ago, abortion was virtually equivalent to homicide, and euthanasia was universally condemned as murder. Today, abortion is considered by many to be a basic right rather than a crime, and the advocates of euthanasia are within reach of legalizing termination of life. Social conditions and attitudes have radically altered laws pertaining to life and death. This he wrote 35 years ago. Today it's much worse. So we're proud that for us, Hashem determines the definition of justice. And therefore, if you would make a study in this week's parsha, whether it's the laws of im kesef talva lending, or whether ozav tazev ima, you have to help the person who's called soinacha. I think we once spoke about a couple of these examples. You'll see that the human definition of what means to be magnanimous, of what means to be altruistic, doesn't scratch the surface of what the definition of those words would mean according to the Torah. Because since the source of justice and kindness comes from Hashem, so therefore the level, the standard is infinitely greater and higher. It's not within the scope of this talk to be able to give examples. So we're talking about chai, life. So what is life? One of my mashpiyim, Rabbi Yel, used to say, and he lisps, what does it mean that you're alive? As a trakat nicht begefahrt. What does it mean that you're alive? That you weren't hit by a truck yet? That just means you're existing. But what does it mean to be alive? To be alive does not mean to merely exist. And as the previous Rebbe says in a mimer someplace, it's bad enough you exist. You're proud of it? So, if someone just exists, that means he's taking up space. You have to accentuate the better part of yourself, the good part of yourself. And that's your reason to exist. I once heard an anecdote, which I like very much. And that is, there was once a person who was very, very desperate to find out the purpose in life. And he heard there's a guru who lives in a faraway country on top of a mountain, in a cave. And he has the answer to the purpose of life. So he traveled to this faraway country, and he came to the country, he traveled to where this mountain was, and he asked to have an audience with this guru. They told him, you think you can just have an audience with the guru? You have to have serious preparations. You have to fast, pray, and meditate for 20 years. And then you can have an audience with this guru. So he fasted and prayed and meditated for 20 years. Finally, he gets a chance to go up the mountain, into the cave, and there's curtains there. The curtains part, and he sees a wise old man sitting on a velvet pillow. And he asks the old man, the guru, what is the purpose of life? And the Guru lifts up the old eyes, looks straight into the man, and says, life, my son, is a fish. And in that instant, the curtain closed. The person started screaming, what do you mean life is like a fish? They said, only one question per audience. If you want to ask him another question, you have to prepare yourself for another 20 years. He went down the mountain, he fasted, he prayed for another 20 years. It's now 40 years. Finally, he goes up the mountain again. Same situation, the curtains part. And this time, he blurts out and screams out, Master, what is the meaning that life is like a fish? So the old man looks directly into the eyes of this person and says, so life is not like a fish. And the curtains close. It's a beautiful anecdote because in a certain sense it reflects many, many times scientific conclusions or scientific discoveries about things. Forest fires are good, forest fires are not good. Are males different from females? Are females different from males? Homework is good for teenagers or not? Etc., etc., etc. Many, many times science can come along and say, we made a mistake. But in Torah, Baruch Hashem, we never have stories where we come along and we say, we made a mistake. And that's why we have absolute standards. And we say, Ve'ele ha-Mishpotim, ma'elu misinai af-elu misinai. Thank you, Hashem, that our level, standard of justice is beyond anything that anyone could imagine. And the reason is because it starts from you. They're not man-made. And this is also connected with the month of Adar. The whole idea of Adar is simcha. Mishenichnas Adar marben b'simcha. One of the ways that we come to joy, we say, Ein simcha ka'atoras asfekas. There's no joy like the removal of doubts. When you have laws that are man-made, then they could be full of doubts. Because you can never get out of it. You say like this, I say like that. You think like this, I think like that. But when you have the laws that start from God, then we know that they're truth and they're eternal forever. Just to have an example of what means really life. There's a story I heard from Reb Melech, another one of my Mishpotim, that in Russia, in the war years, which were very, very hard and harsh, and many people died, passed away from hunger, there was a chassid who was very, very ill, and he was dying from hunger. And it was the time of Yutes Kislev, one of the most famous celebrations, Yomim Tovim by Chabad, by Hasidim. And he was deathly ill, and he asked to be brought to the Fabrengen on his deathbed. And they brought him on his bed to the Fabrengen. And he passed away. Hashem Yirachem. He passed away during the Fabrengen. Another elderly chassid came to the Rebbe many years later, and he went into Yechidus. He had an audience with the Rebbe, and he told the Rebbe the story. And the Rebbe told him, by the next Fabrengen, or by the next Yutes Kislev, by the next Fabrengen, you should start the Fabrengen with this story. How there was a chassid in Russia who was so ill, and he was dying, and his wish is to be brought to a Fabrengen of Chassidim. Because that's life. Life is sitting and spending time with fellow Yidden, saying L'chaim, to life, V'levracha. Every minute of life, we could realize what's really the importance of life is life. So, Good Shabbos, let us connect ourselves to absolute knowledge, absolute kindness, absolute compassion, absolute mishpotim, as the Eibishter tells us, af elu misinai. Let us learn them and study them to come to higher levels of appreciation of Mahurach, Mafatachanun, Mahurach, Mafatarach, Mahuchanan, Afatachanan. Learn to emulate what Hashem teaches us and wants us to inculcate and live with. These ideas and these laws that have been Adam L'Chaveirei, so we should come to higher levels of treating our fellow man better, with more kindness, with more love, with more compassion. And we'll act in such a way, we'll have more simcha, and it will definitely bring, since it's an increase of Ahavas Yisrael, the Gula, Mitzvah Shlema, take it from Yad Mamish. Posting from my home, Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, your man in Melbourne.